Why food sucked in ancient Egypt. Hey guys, tonight we descend into the sand-blown kitchens of ancient Egypt where life wasn't just ruled by pharaohs and pyramids, but by survival. You might picture golden feasts beside the Nile, figs, roasted ducks, honey cakes glistening under the sun. But let's peel back the illusion. That was for a tiny sliver of society. For the vast majority of Egyptians, food wasn't about flavor or joy. It was a struggle, a daily negotiation with dust, decay, and desperation. So before you drift off, go ahead and like this video if you enjoyed dozing off to tales of grit, grime, and ancient absurdities. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always amazing to see how far this caravan of sleepy history travels. Now, let's travel back 4,000 years to the banks of the Nile and dive into why food seriously sucked in ancient Egypt. Let's start with the land. Egypt was called the gift of the Nile, and it was. But gifts come with strings. The Nile flooded annually, and that flood was life. It watered the land, fertilized the soil, but it was fickle. Too much flooding? Villages were wiped out. Too little? Starvation. Just right? You still had to toil in brutal heat, barefoot, bent over fields from dawn to dusk, planting barley and emmer wheat with tools not far removed from sticks. And all that labor for food that was, frankly, depressing. Bread was the foundation of the Egyptian diet. It was everywhere, all the time. But calling it bread might give you the wrong idea. This wasn't a warm, fluffy loaf. It was dense, hard, and often laced with sand. That's not an exaggeration. Egyptian flour was ground with sandstone tools that shed grit into the mix. By the time the dough was baked in clay ovens or on hot stones, it had enough rock particles to strip enamel from your teeth. Archaeologists regularly find ancient Egyptian skulls with teeth ground down to nubs, not from fighting or accidents, from bread. Eating it was like chewing gravel. Now, imagine starting your day with that. No butter, no jam, no sweet morning treat, just a chunk of yesterday's brick-like loaf and a cup of beer. Yes, beer. Not as a reward at the end of a long day, but as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Egyptians drank beer constantly because the water wasn't safe. But this wasn't the golden ale of your imagination. It was thick, sour, and full of floating bits, more like drinkable bread pudding than anything refreshing. Even kids drank it. It had nutrients, sure, but also the consistency of sludge and a flavor profile that screamed desperation. Vegetables were available, but limited and seasonal. Leeks, onions, garlic, lettuce, maybe cucumbers if you were lucky. Most meals were simple stews or boiled grain mushes that lacked any real taste. Herbs like coriander and dill could be found. But salt was expensive, and spices were basically mythical unless you were royalty. So, meals weren't seasoned. They were tolerated. You ate because you had to, not because you wanted to. Meat? Rare. Unless an animal dropped dead, it wasn't showing up at dinner. Fish from the Nile was more common, but the blazing sun turned fresh catch into a stinking mess fast. Preservation methods existed, salting and drying, but they weren't always effective. And even when they worked, the result was often more chew toy than cuisine. Now let's talk about fruit. Dates and figs were the sweet escape for most Egyptians. They were cherished, treasured, and eaten with a sense of wonder. But they were seasonal and not nearly plentiful enough to be more than an occasional joy. For a peasant, A single date might be split among 3 children. A fig was dessert for a festival. And while we're on the topic of special occasions, festival food was different. If a cow or goat was sacrificed for a religious celebration, people got to eat meat, real, grilled, slightly charred, delicious meat. But this wasn't Tuesday night dinner. It was once a season, maybe twice a year. The rest of the time, protein came from legumes, lentils, and beans, which were nutritious but repetitive, and after a while, depressing. Let's talk cooking. Kitchens didn't exist in the way we think. Cooking was done outside, over open fires or in small clay ovens. The desert wind was always blowing. Sand got into everything: stew with a side of dust, bread with a crunch of grit. Even boiling water couldn't escape the environment. Your meals always had texture, and not the good kind. And what about storage? There were no fridges, no cellars. Food spoiled fast. You ate what you had while it was still edible. Preservation was hit or miss. Most households relied on earthen jars, tightly woven baskets, or pits in the ground to store grain and legumes. But pests were relentless: insects, rats, mold. You might bite into a piece of bread and find a surprise, alive or dead. Hygiene? Primitive. People bathed in the Nile, which was also where waste was dumped. Hands weren't washed with soap. Soap wasn't even a thing for the average Egyptian, so food prep involved unwashed hands, dust-covered tools, and open exposure to the elements. Illness from contaminated food wasn't just common, it was expected. You got stomach cramps. That was Tuesday. Diarrhea? Part of the package. Food poisoning was an invisible, unavoidable part of life. And still, they ate because they had to. Because even gritty bread and sour beer were better than hunger. So let's step back. Why did food suck in ancient Egypt? Because everything, from the tools to the climate to the social structure, made eating a struggle. The rich had access to honey, fruit, spices, fresh fish, even wine. They dined indoors with plates and cups, and sometimes even utensils. But the poor, they crouched beside fires, dipped crusts into watery broth, and prayed the food wouldn't make them sick. Yet, here's the twist: Egyptians still treated food with reverence. They placed loaves in tombs for the dead. They carved images of banquets on tomb walls, because even in its blandness, even in its hardship, food meant life. It was sacred, necessary, and deeply symbolic. So tonight, as you sip clean water or munch a snack, remember, in ancient Egypt, that would have been luxury. Bread was a gamble, beer, a necessity, and flavor, that was for the gods. Sleep well. And next, we'll walk through one day in the life of a farmer. From the moment his eyes opened to the last sip of warm, sandy beer before sleep, the sky is still a pale gray when he opens his eyes. No alarm clock, no rooster, just the slow, heavy rhythm of life in the fields. A faint breeze pushes fine grains of sand across the worn mud bricks of the house. His back is sore, his stomach already growling. He slept on a woven reed mat under a wool blanket that smells faintly of smoke and dust. There's no time to stretch, no time to hesitate. Hunger doesn't wait. The day begins. He stands and rolls his shoulders. The house is small, one room, shared with his wife, 3 children, and maybe a goat if it wandered in again during the night. Outside, the sun hasn't cleared the horizon yet, but the air is already warm. A neighbor is moving quietly, carrying a bundle of firewood. A child cries. Somewhere in the distance, The river murmurs. Breakfast is what's left from yesterday. A slab of barley bread, so dense it could stop a spear. It's dry, cracked, dusty. He chews slowly, each bite a grindstone against his teeth. There's a small pot with last night's lentil mash, cold and clumped. It smells faintly sour. He dips the bread into it, swallows. It's not delicious. It's not meant to be. He washes it down with beer. Yes, beer. Thick, soupy, and barely fermented. More porridge than beverage. His youngest doesn't like the taste, but drinks anyway. Everyone does. Because the Nile's water, though sacred, is often deadly. You either drink beer or you risk disease. There's a small clay jar with garlic cloves. A few remain. His wife gives him one. It burns his tongue, sharp and intense, but it helps wake him up. A luxury, really. Garlic is food and medicine. It wards off illness and spirits. According to his grandmother, anyway. He grabs his tool, a curved wooden hoe. Simple, splintered, effective. His wife hands him a reed basket, already patched 3 times. The children stay behind. The eldest, barely 12, will fetch water and look after the animals. The youngest still sleeps, thumb in mouth, curled in a corner. He steps outside. The world is brown and gold. Dust swirls. Birds caw overhead. The fields stretch toward the riverbank, where papyrus grows thick and tangled. His bare feet know the way. It's a long walk, maybe 2 miles. He joins other farmers along the path. No one talks. Everyone is chewing something, or just trying to ignore the gnawing in their bellies. By mid-morning, the sun is cruel. Sweat clings to his skin. His back bends again and again as he works the earth, carving rows into dry soil. If the Nile floods well, the harvest will come. If not, they'll face rationing, hunger, maybe worse. The sun scorches everything. His tunic sticks to his back. A boy nearby collapses. The others help him up. No one panics. It's just the way things go. The heat doesn't show mercy, not even to the young. Lunch is brief, a shared moment under a skinny tree. His wife packed more bread and a small handful of boiled legumes. The bread is cracked, harder than this morning's. There's no shade, really, just less sun. He eats slowly, mindful not to finish everything. He needs some for the walk back. Flies circle. He swats them lazily. A neighbor pulls out a piece of dried fish, gray and stiff like bark. The two share a few bites. It tastes awful, but it's protein, a gift, something different. He thinks of the last festival. The temple offered stew with meat. Goat, maybe. It was rich, oily, too much for his stomach to handle. He was sick that night, but happy. Meat meant celebration. There's no clean water to rinse his hands. They're stained with soil. He wipes them on his tunic. It doesn't help. His fingernails are black with dirt. He shrugs. By afternoon, the labor is mechanical. The sun presses down like a punishment. His hands blister. His lips crack. The Nile glimmers in the distance, taunting. But there's still work to do. Weeding, clearing, checking the irrigation canals for blockage. He sees a snake slither past. Doesn't flinch. It's just part of the scenery. Sometimes he sings while he works. Old work songs passed down from his father. They don't make the work easier, but they give it rhythm, meaning, a pulse, 1 foot in front of the other, 1 row of crops at a time. There are days when things go wrong. A water wheel breaks. A neighbor collapses from heat. Sometimes they find someone stealing grain. Desperation is common, especially near harvest season. Hunger makes people do things they swore they'd never do. Once, when he was a child, he watched his father boil reeds and chew them like vegetables. There was nothing else to eat that week. He remembers the bitterness, the silence at dinner, the feeling of his ribs poking through his skin. By evening, the work slows, the temperature drops slightly, the wind picks up again, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant cook fires. He walks home with aching feet, each step heavier than the last. The basket is empty, the work is done, for now. Dinner is boiling in a clay pot when he returns. It's lentils again, with maybe a few wilted greens from the field's edge. His wife stirs slowly. The children sit on the floor, tired and hungry. There's no firewood left, so she's burning dried dung. The smoke curls into the air, sharp and acrid. There's a small piece of dried date, split into four, a treat, a dessert. Each child gets a bite. He watches his daughter give her share to the youngest. She doesn't say anything, just smiles. That's what love looks like here. The family eats together, using fingers and silence. The bread is reheated slightly, still tough. The stew is thin, but warm, and somehow comforting. He savors every bite, not because it's delicious, but because it's done. The work, the day. After dinner, he steps outside. The sky is deep purple, stars blinking softly. Somewhere, a priest is chanting. Somewhere else, a dog barks. He doesn't say anything, just sits on a rock and exhales. Another day survived. Tomorrow might bring change. The tax collector might come early. A sick animal might need to be slaughtered. The youngest might run a fever. But tonight, they have eaten. Inside, the house is dim and smoky. The children sleep, curled like cats. His wife braids a cord by firelight. He watches her, grateful. She manages to make something out of nothing. Every day, he lays down on the mat, pulling the scratchy blanket over them all. The room smells of sweat and dust and life. He closes his eyes and dreams of a better meal, one with roasted fish, fresh bread, maybe a fig, maybe two. But morning will come fast, and with it, more bread, more beer, more toil. Sleep tight. Welcome to dinner, Ancient Egypt edition. Food didn't just need to be grown, it had to last. In a world without ice, refrigerators, or airtight containers, preservation wasn't a convenience. It was the daily difference between having dinner and going hungry. So, as you settle in, maybe wrapped in a blanket, maybe with a snack beside you, consider this. What would you eat if nothing could last longer than a day? Let's begin with a problem: heat. Egypt is hot. Not summer at the beach hot, relentless, bone drying, sun baking hot. The kind of heat that spoils milk before noon and turns fresh meat into a buzzing mess by sunset. The Nile gave life, yes, but it also gave humidity, insects, and floods. Preserving food wasn't about technique, it was about survival. The simplest method was drying. The sun, that constant overseer of Egyptian life, became a partner in food preservation. Dates, figs, legumes, anything small, with low moisture, could be sun-dried. Fruit was sliced and laid on woven mats. Beans were shelled and spread on rooftops. Grains were fanned and turned with care. But it wasn't easy. Drying took time. Wind could blow everything away. Birds could snatch what they wanted. Dust settled on everything, and the sun didn't always cooperate. During the inundation, the annual flood, the air turned thick and damp. Drying failed. Mold won. Salt came next. Precious and powerful. Egyptians mined it from dry lake beds, and traded it along the Mediterranean. But it wasn't cheap. Salt could preserve fish, meat, even vegetables, but only if you had enough. For peasants, it was rationed, stored in clay jars, and hidden from moisture. A family might salt a few fish during a good season and hope they'd last. But salt draws moisture, and in a humid kitchen, that meant disaster. A single cracked jar could ruin a month's supply. Smoking food was possible, but rare. Wood was valuable. Most homes burned dried dung or papyrus stems. Getting a good, steady smoke meant real fuel, patience, and space. Only wealthier households could afford to smoke meat properly. The poor, if they tried, did so outdoors, over small fires built from scraps. Smoke might mask the rot, but it rarely stopped it. The result was chewy, bitter, and uncertain. Then there was oil. Pressed from sesame or flax seeds, it acted as a seal. Sometimes vegetables were boiled and stored in oil. But again, oil was wealth. The average household couldn't spare it. And even when used, it didn't stop fermentation. It just slowed the inevitable. Storage was another battle entirely. Granaries dotted the landscape of Egypt, not just state-run, but private. Large jars were sunk into the ground. Basket-lined pits were common, but they were not airtight. Mice, weevils, and mold were frequent visitors. Grain spoiled. Bugs multiplied. Sometimes people ate infested grain anyway. The crunch wasn't welcome, but neither was hunger. Clay pots stored dried legumes, salt, flour, oil. But clay is fragile. One drop, one crack, and weeks of food were gone. Lids didn't always seal. Ants found their way inside, and lifting heavy jars by hand day after day led to broken backs and broken pottery. Even water needed storage. Nile water wasn't clean, and wells weren't common. People stored water in tall jars, sealed with cloth or palm fiber, but bacteria didn't care. A bad jar meant diarrhea, fever, or worse. There were no filters, no treatment, just faith and beer. Beer was safer. Let's talk about insects. In a hot, open-air kitchen, they were everywhere. Flies buzzed over fish. Beetles crawled through flour. Worms hatched in figs. Food was covered with cloth, weighted with stones, hung from ceilings. But it was never safe. Even in temples, even in palaces, bugs were part of the meal. Not intentionally, just inevitably. Spoilage smelled. It changed the air. People knew the signs. The sour sting of rotting onions, the slick sheen of spoiled oil, the cloying stink of bad meat. They didn't know microbes, but they knew decay. They'd scrape mold from bread, rinse off beans, cook the bad bits longer, hoping fire would kill whatever hid inside. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. People got sick. Often, food poisoning wasn't diagnosed. It was survived. Or not. Children were especially vulnerable. So were the elderly, pregnant women. There were no doctors for peasants. Just herbs, just prayers, just rest. And if someone died, the spoiled pot was buried with them. Religion didn't help much, except to comfort. Offerings were made to gods for good harvests. Tombs were stocked with bread, beer, and onions, as if the dead might still get hungry. The idea of food lasting forever was more fantasy than fact. Even the sacred loaves turned to dust. But it was symbolic. Eternal meals for eternal souls. And yet, through all this, rot, mold, pests, people found ways to make it work. They stored what they could, shared when possible, traded dried fish for garlic, bartered salt for beans. Neighbors checked each other's jars. They learned which foods spoiled first, which cracks meant disaster, which clay jars were cursed. There were stories, too, warnings. Don't open the left jar. It holds last season's rot. Don't trust dried figs before mid-month. Don't leave lentils near the fire. They absorb ghosts. These weren't just superstitions. They were lessons wrapped in memory. Preservation wasn't just technical. It was emotional. Imagine watching your last jar of barley bloom with mold. Imagine unsealing your fish stash and finding maggots. Imagine trying to explain to your child why dinner tonight is nothing. Not because you didn't plan, but because time and heat and chance conspired against you. Imagine that feeling, slow dread, hunger waiting, and nothing left but sour beer. This was the quiet crisis behind every Egyptian home. Not just growing food, but keeping it alive, keeping it edible, holding back rot with stone jars and straw lids, fighting time with salt and smoke. So tonight, as your fridge hums, your pantry glows, and your leftovers wait safely for tomorrow, remember them, the ones who measured life, not in calories or flavor, but in days between spoilage, who lived under a sun that blessed and punished, who stored their hopes in clay and watched some shatter. Sleep well. Next time, we'll walk through the temple kitchens and see how the gods ate and what made their food different from the rest of Egypt. We step away from the dusty huts of farmers and into the cold, stone corridors of Egyptian temples. Here, food was different, still plain, often bland, but elevated by meaning. Because this wasn't food for survival. This was food for the gods. Ancient Egyptian temples were more than places of prayer. They were cities within cities, administrative hubs, schools, granaries, workshops, kitchens. And in these kitchens, food was not only prepared, it was sanctified, ritualized, cooked not to nourish human bodies, but to honor divine ones. Every day, priests prepared elaborate meals, not for themselves, but for statues. Yes, statues. The god didn't eat in the way humans did, but offerings were made anyway. Fresh bread, onions, beer, dates, sometimes meat, if the temple was rich. And though the gods didn't take a bite, these meals were treated with total seriousness. It was about order, about Mat, the sacred balance of the universe. The meals followed strict rules. Everything had to be pure. The bread couldn't be touched by dirty hands. The beer had to be freshly brewed. The vegetables rinsed in clean water, which in itself was rare. Knives, pots, plates, everything was cleaned daily, sometimes with natron salt. Priests shaved their bodies to avoid shedding hair near sacred food. Silence was common in temple kitchens. Work was ritual. Cooking was prayer. Each temple had its own schedule. Offerings were made 3 times a day, morning, midday, and evening. The morning meal was most important. It was placed before the deity's statue, accompanied by incense and chant. The food sat in silence. Later, it was removed. Some was eaten by the priests. Some was stored. Some, especially leftovers, was discarded, but not in the trash. There was no such thing. Sacred food was never just tossed. It might be buried, burned, given to animals. It still held power, even cold, even rotting, because it had touched the divine. Let's talk about the menu. It was richer than a peasant's, but not extravagant. Bread came in many forms, loaves shaped like animals, flowers, cones. Some were dyed or sweetened with date syrup. Others were plain. Beer, too, came in grades. The temple's beer was thick, potent, brewed from the finest grain. Vegetables included leeks, cucumbers, garlic. Fruit meant dates, figs, sometimes grapes. Meat was rare but possible. Duck, goose, oxen, fish from sacred ponds. And on festival days, the kitchens came alive. Those were the loud days. Days of color, smell, movement. Whole animals roasted over open fires. Bread baked in massive batches. Spices, coriander, cumin, stolen from merchants or gifted by nobles. Musicians played. Perfume clouded the air. It was still worship, but it was also theater. The temple kitchens were staffed by more than priests. Cooks, bakers, brewers, butchers, all trained in ritual. Some were blindfolded to prevent them from seeing the god. Some weren't allowed to speak. One wrong word, one wrong cut of meat, and the whole offering could be ruined. The food wasn't eaten by the god, but by the people who served him. The leftovers were distributed in hierarchies. High priests got the best parts. Lower staff shared what remained. Outsiders? Rarely. The sacred kitchen was exclusive. Now imagine the contrast. Outside the walls, farmer boiled lentils in a cracked pot. Inside, a statue received a plate of honeyed dates. Outside, a child cried from hunger. Inside, priests sorted piles of sacred bread. But even priests went hungry sometimes. Temples suffered droughts, bad harvests, invasions. Offerings shrank. A god once given 3 geese a day might get 1 onion. And still the rituals went on. The illusion of abundance had to be maintained, because to stop feeding the gods was to invite chaos. Preserving temple food followed stricter practices. Bread was baked harder, beer was sealed better, fruit was stored in cool chambers, spices were kept in tightly lidded jars. And even with all this care, spoilage happened. Mold crept in, rats nibbled. The gods, it seems, weren't spared from the laws of nature. But that didn't stop the rituals, because in Egypt, rituals held the world together. The act of offering mattered more than the quality of the meal. The gods didn't need to eat, but people needed to offer. And perhaps the greatest irony? Some of the best food in Egypt was made for those who couldn't taste it, and some of the worst for those who couldn't avoid it. So tonight, as you think about what's in your fridge, remember, in ancient Egypt, food was sacred not because of how it tasted, but because of who it was for. Sleep well. Next, we explore food and disease, the invisible dangers that lurked in every bite. We're not in a battlefield or a temple. We array in the soft space between hunger and harm, the space where bad bread becomes a slow killer and sour beer carries more than bitterness. In ancient Egypt, disease wasn't just in the air, it was in the food. Let's begin with the obvious. No refrigeration. That means milk spoiled in hours, meat in minutes. Fish caught at dawn could make you sick by lunch. But the Egyptians didn't understand bacteria. They had no concept of germs. Illness came from spirits, imbalance, or the displeasure of gods. Food wasn't contaminated. It was cursed. And yet, they lived with symptoms: diarrhea, vomiting, cramps, fever. These were so common, they became part of daily life. Children cried with stomach aches. Adults worked through nausea. The weak stayed in bed, or in the shade, or in the dirt, curled, waiting it out. There were no clinics, no doctors for peasants, just herbs, just rest, just hope. Let's talk bread again. Ground with stone tools, Egyptian flour contained grit, real grit. Sand and mineral dust from the millstones ended up in every loaf. Eating it was like chewing a bit of desert. Over time, this wore down teeth. Not just wore, they shattered. X-rays of mummies show jaws with teeth ground flat, some abscessed, some infected to the bone. A toothache could become a death sentence. An infected gum could spread to the blood. And once that infection spread, there was no rescue, no antibiotics. The best remedy was a poultice of honey or garlic, maybe an incantation. Some people tied amulets around their necks, believing it would pull the sickness out. But mostly, they suffered quietly. The pain lingered for weeks, sometimes months, until the body gave in. Then there were lentils, a staple food, nutritious, reliable, but if not cooked thoroughly, they caused bloating and cramps. If spoiled, they carried parasites, and lentils were cooked in old pots, cracked and unclean, often rinsed in Nile water that carried human waste, water that sparkled by day and sickened by night. Beer was safer than water, but only just. It was fermented, yes, but not filtered. It carried bits of grain, yeast, and often mold. It was drunk all day by all ages. A bad batch could bring on fever, or worse, and you wouldn't know until it was too late. Meat, when eaten, was often risky, rarely fresh, almost always tough, and if preserved badly, full of bacteria. Fish were salted or dried, but not always well. One storm could raise the Nile, soak the drying racks, and ruin everything. And yet people still ate, because there was nothing else. Mold was ever present, on bread, in jars, on fruits, blue, white, green. No one understood it. Some scraped it off. Some didn't. Mold meant damp. Damp meant rot. Rot meant sickness. But the line between spoiled and edible was blurry. In lean times, everything was edible, even when it wasn't. The Nile itself was beautiful and deadly. It gave life, yes, but it carried decay. People bathed in it, washed clothes, dumped waste, and then drew water for soup. Boiling helped, sometimes, but not always. Schistosomiasis, a parasite, thrived in Nile water. It burrowed into skin, into intestines, into organs. It caused bleeding, pain, slow, invisible death. Children were especially vulnerable. Malnourished and small, they caught infections easily. A little diarrhea could dehydrate them to death. In some villages, babies were fed beer as early as 1 year old. Not for fun, but for survival. And still, many didn't make it. Food handlers were not trained. Hands were not washed. Cooking was done in the open, with flies circling. Tools weren't sanitized. They were reused, shared, patched. A knife used for fish might slice bread next. A bowl holding beans might later hold stew. Cross-contamination wasn't a term, but it was a reality. Worms were common. Flatworms, roundworms, tapeworms. They lived in undercooked meat, dirty vegetables, or unwashed hands. They caused weight loss, fatigue, and sometimes madness. But to the Egyptian mind, it was fate, a test, a spirit, something to endure. Malnutrition made it worse. Even when food was plentiful, it lacked variety. Bread, lentils, beer, repeat, no citrus, no dairy, no clean protein. This led to deficiencies, anemia, weak bones, low immunity. A small infection became a big one. A scratch could fester. A cold could kill. Skeletons tell the story. Archaeologists find curved spines, bowed legs, signs of scurvy. Some mummies reveal signs of tuberculosis, of rickets, of anemia so severe the skulls thinned and warped. The body kept score. It always does. And yet, medicine existed. Sort of. recipes written on papyrus, lists of herbs, rituals, strange mixtures, onion poultices, garlic rubs, honey compresses. Some helped, some didn't. Temples housed healers, but most people couldn't go or didn't trust them. So illness remained personal, quiet, endured in shadows. Then there were superstitions, bad luck from eating food dropped on the floor, illness from sharing garlic with the wrong person, curses tied to spoiled figs. People whispered warnings, passed down from grandmothers. They weren't scientific, but they came from centuries of watching loved ones fall sick. Even the priests weren't immune. Despite better food, their beer could still sour, their bread could still mold. Rats didn't care about sacred walls. Disease moved silently, from temple kitchens to back alley huts, from granaries to tombs. Everyone was vulnerable. Still, most people survived. They adapted, developed resistance, knew when to eat, when to fast, when to bury a pot, and never speak of it again. They lived cautiously, but also stubbornly, because life was hard and death was close. But food meant hope. So tonight, as you lie down, with clean water by your bed and antibiotics, a phone call away, remember the Egyptians who chewed gravel bread, drank sour beer, and fought invisible enemies with nothing but prayers and grit. Next, we'll end with a final scene. What happens to food when you die? Yes, the afterlife has a menu, and we're about to read it. No more kitchens, no more pots, no more buzzing flies. We enter the still air of tombs, the silent homes of eternity. In ancient Egypt, food didn't just feed the living, it followed them into death. Because when life ends, hunger doesn't. At least, not in their world. Let's begin at the moment of death. A body lies still. Family weeps. But the work has only begun. Embalmers arrive. Priests chant. And in the middle of this sacred ritual, food appears. Bread, beer, onions, maybe a cut of meat, if the family can afford it. These are not snacks for the mourners. These are offerings for the journey. Death was not the end. It was a transition, a journey through deserts, rivers, and gates guarded by monstrous beings. The soul would be judged by Osiris, the heart weighed against a feather, and through it all, one thing remained essential: provisions. Tombs were stocked like pantries, loaves of bread, real ones, or stone imitations, jars of beer, baskets of onions, garlic, lentils, dried fish, even preserved meat. In some cases, clay models of food replaced the real thing: miniature geese, tiny loaves, fake jars filled with air. Why? Because magic made them real. Words carved on walls, spells from the Book of the Dead, told the offerings what to become. The process of stocking the tomb was deliberate. Scribes documented each item. Priests supervised its placement. Storage rooms were built into the tomb's architecture. Some had shelves, others niches. In wealthier tombs, walk-in pantries held weeks' worth of food. Real food. Meat dried in the sun, bread wrapped in linen, jars sealed with wax and reed. Rats and mold were feared even in death. The goal was preservation, not just of the body, but of the banquet. Rich tombs held full feasts. Poor graves had simple baskets, but always something. Because to enter the next world, hungry was to enter weak, powerless, unprepared. The gods, too, expected food. Offerings were made daily at temples, not just for the living, but for the dead. Pharaohs were fed in perpetuity. Their tombs had kitchens, priests, storage rooms. Their statues received plates of food each day, not because they ate, but because they must never be forgotten. Eternal memory required eternal meals. Now, imagine the menu: bread, hard, triangular loaves, baked to last; beer, sealed in tall jars, thick and dense; meat, salted duck, dried ox, fish rolled in herbs, onions and garlic, thought to awaken the dead; figs and dates for sweetness; honey, if fortune smiled. Some tombs included lotus roots, cheese, even tiny cakes for celebration days. Some tombs held lists, menus for the afterlife: 2 geese per day, 3 loaves, 1 jar of beer, 4 onions. Not metaphors, instructions, orders to the universe. Some tomb texts even included food wishes for specific festivals: extra honey for the new year, fermented fish for river rituals, or grape cakes for the Day of the Dead. Food was carved on walls, painted in vivid color. Banquets shone in eternal scenes: music, wine, laughter, not memories, promises, a meal not yet eaten, but always waiting. Entire walls were covered with market scenes, kitchens, fields being plowed, ensuring that the dead wouldn't just eat, but would also possess the eternal infrastructure of food production. But there was fear too. What if the food rotted? What if the tomb was robbed? What if no one remembered to bring offerings? That's where spells came in. They empowered the dead to summon food themselves. Let there be bread. Let there be beer. Let there be meat from the altar of Heliopolis. In essence, magic became the pantry. Words fed the soul. Priests had jobs beyond the funeral. They became chefs of eternity. Funerary priests were paid to maintain tomb offerings, recite spells, and replace food. This service could last years, or collapse if the family lost wealth. Some tombs were maintained for generations. Others fell silent after a single year. These priests operated in tomb complexes that included granaries, bakeries, and butcher stations. It was a full industry of feeding the dead. Contracts were made, payments promised, grain exchanged for daily loaves, a sacred economy. The poor adapted. They buried food in small jars or painted meals on coffin lids. A drawn loaf was better than none. They whispered prayers, left garlic at graves, said names aloud, anything to keep the ka, one's vital essence, fed. In some regions, families held annual remembrance picnics by the tomb, reactivating the bond between living and dead with shared meals. Unfed souls were feared, called mut or aku spirits. They were said to wander, bitter and vengeful, seeking scraps from the living, a shadow at your fire, a whisper by your ear. They weren't evil, they were hungry. That's why names mattered, why steles were carved, why tombs faced roads. So passers-by might say, bread and beer for the ka of Amenemhat. That simple phrase gave life, not metaphorically, literally. A soul remembered was a soul fed. Let's not forget the funerary banquet. After burial, the living shared a meal near the tomb: bread, beer, meat, if possible. It was both offering and farewell, and leftovers, sometimes left for the dead, sometimes eaten by priests. Sacred, symbolic, practical, these meals were often accompanied by music and incense, turning the send-off into a celebration. The line between food and ritual blurred. A loaf was a prayer, a jar of beer, a hymn. Each item placed in the tomb was both sustenance and spell. The more food one could bring, the greater the status in the afterlife. Scarcity followed people even into death. Still, even kings couldn't stop time. Mold crept in, jars cracked, Some tombs were looted, their meals stolen, others sealed so well that offerings remained centuries later. Crumbs of bread, seeds of dates, bones of geese. Food meant for a soul that never returned. Archaeologists have found scenes of eternal kitchens, servants baking, brewing, butchering in stone reliefs, a world frozen in preparation. The work never finished, the feast never served. These reliefs were not decorative, they were functional magic, ensuring that food was made forever. Even in the grandest tombs, food was a symbol of both permanence and fragility. It was the promise of continuity, the hope that the same hands who fed you in life would feed your memory in death. And if not, the silence of an empty offering table would echo louder than any chant. Among the lesser known rituals was the opening of the mouth ceremony, where a symbolic gesture allowed the deceased to eat and drink in the afterlife. Priests touched the mummy's face with sacred tools, spoons, ladles, even meat cleavers, to awaken their senses. It was not just spiritual, it was culinary resurrection. The dead were not only fed, they were expected to dine. Afterlife texts describe them sitting in banquet halls, surrounded by family and divine guests. Plates refilled endlessly, cups brimming, no hunger, no spoilage, just eternal, peaceful satisfaction. Yet even this perfection required maintenance. Forgotten tombs became silent. Names unspoken meant hunger returned. That's why descendants hired ritual readers to walk the necropolises, calling out names, offering crumbs, pouring beer into the sand. So tonight, as you rest with your stomach full and your name intact, remember, in ancient Egypt, they believed what you ate in life was only half the story. The real feast came after death. If you were lucky, sleep well, and next time you pass bread to someone, think of it as a blessing, because somewhere in another world, someone still waits for their dinner, sitting at the edge of a tomb. Because in ancient Egypt, food wasn't always a gift. Sometimes it was a threat, a message, a curse. Bread, so simple, so basic, was the backbone of life. But in the realm of death, it could change roles. In tombs where vengeance simmered and memory soured, food offerings were deliberately ruined. A loaf split in half, beer poured onto the dirt, onions crushed underfoot. These weren't accidents, they were signs, warnings to tomb robbers, traitorous kin, or forgetful descendants. Let's begin with the physical curses. Some tombs featured carved threats right on the food offerings. Cursed be the one who eats this bread. May his tongue dry like the Nile in drought. Or worse, may the beer burn his belly and the onions blind his eyes. These inscriptions weren't poetry, they were protection. Food was bait, but poisoned by words. There were more subtle tactics too. In some graves, the food was placed in grotesque arrangements: an upside down table, a broken jar, a roasted bird posed backwards. These oddities were messages. To the living, stay away. To the dead, be vigilant. In one tomb, a painted offering scene includes a bread basket tipped over, spilling blackened loaves. Archaeologists thought it was damage until they realized it was intentional, an eternal warning. Why ruin food? Because food was power. To sabotage a meal was to sabotage the soul it was meant for. Angry heirs denied ancestors their due. Tomb keepers settled old scores. A forgotten mother left a dry onion for her son because he never visited. The symbolism was sharp. Even in death, your plate could be emptied by the living. But not all cursed food looked cursed. Some offerings were cursed from within. Magic loading they called it. A loaf might be baked with a charm folded inside, a sliver of papyrus with a hex, or the beer might be brewed with a whisper, a spiteful chant the recipient wouldn't know until they felt it. The hunger that wouldn't leave, the thirst that soured the mouth, the eternal indigestion of a soul wronged. Some spells were inverted offerings. Let this loaf appear whole, but feed no one. Let this beer look full, but turn to dust in the Ka's throat. These were the weapons of the petty and powerful alike, for when a priest was bribed, or a widow angry, or a rival, family insulted at burial, there is one recorded tomb curse that simply says, "He who eats this bread eats shame." A quiet phrase, but it stuck. The bread was left untouched for 3,000 years. Not all curses were personal. Some were defensive, meant to ward off hungry ghosts. The logic was strange, but firm. Place ruined food near the tomb, and the restless spirits would feed on it instead. Like bait, like distraction. Give them bad beer, and maybe they'd leave the good beer alone. The tomb of Nebrahotep includes offerings that are fake, but convincingly so. Beautifully painted bread on stone trays. But the texts reveal the truth. This food is not real. Let it fool the shadow ones. It's the earliest known case of magical decoys. Fake meals for fake peace. Even during festivals, cursed food had its place. During the Feast of the Valley, some families left plates of burnt food at ancestor altars, not as neglect, but as ritual. It symbolized pain, loss. The food wasn't for the honored dead, but for the dishonored ones, those who betrayed, who shamed, who were remembered but not forgiven. And then there were the edible oaths, foods that sealed agreements beyond death. Two men would bury bread between them. If one broke the vow, the bread would rot in his tomb. An oath gone sour, a pact turned to mold. These rituals didn't exist to entertain. They were serious, sacred, and sometimes terrifying. To a people who believed words held weight, food was never just food. A loaf could be a blessing, or a blade. So tonight, as you reach for a crust or pour a drink, ask yourself, is this meal offered with love or with memory, sharpened like stone? In ancient Egypt, even bread had a message, sometimes warm, sometimes bitter, always worth noticing. Sleep carefully. The next bite may not be yours. We light a lamp for someone who doesn't need light. In ancient Egypt, death didn't end mealtime. It extended the guest list. Because once a year, or sometimes more, the dead were invited home, not in memory, in ritual. This wasn't metaphor, it was logistics. The most famous of these events was the Feast of the Valley, held in Thebes. Picture this: a hot, windless day, priests in procession, families gathered outside tombs, boats crossing the Nile with food, wine, flowers, and linens. They weren't heading to a temple, they were heading to the dead. Tombs, normally sealed, were opened, rooms cleaned, cobwebs swept, old offerings replaced, incense burned, and in front of these doorways to eternity, tables were set, real tables, with real food, bread, beer, meat, if the year had been kind, fresh fruit, rare and precious, baskets of onions and herbs. The food was arranged with care, not for the living, but for the returning Ka, the soul. Families would sit beside these meals, tell stories, laugh, sometimes cry. They weren't eating alone. They were sharing with someone invisible, but present, not symbolically, genuinely. Some tombs included benches for this very purpose, shaded by palm canopies, designed for guests from both sides of life. It was believed the dead could emerge, take in the scent, the essence, maybe even a bite. The feast was a bridge. Inscriptions describe these moments in gentle tones. We poured beer for our father. We placed figs upon his table. His ka rejoiced. His heart grew full. The festival wasn't just one day. In wealthier homes, preparations began weeks in advance. The tomb was polished, offerings commissioned, spells recited, because a disappointed ancestor could mean a disappointing harvest. For those who couldn't afford it, symbolic acts sufficed. A crumb of bread placed on a windowsill, a sip of beer poured onto soil, a whispered name at dusk. In the eyes of the gods, intention mattered more than quantity. Even pharaohs participated. The Valley of the Kings wasn't just for burials, it was for reunions. Kings would travel to ancestral tombs, present offerings, and ask for guidance. The dead advised the living, through dreams, through omens, through silence. Some people wrote letters to the dead, placed beside offerings. These were called letters to the netherworld. A widow might ask her late husband to protect her from a neighbor. A son might beg forgiveness for a delayed visit. Food was the seal, the letter, the plea, the bread, the gift. One recovered letter reads, I give you beer, 3 loaves, and honey. I beg you, stop the illness in our house. Another, Father, I bring onions and figs. I cannot bring more, but I remember you. That must be enough. There were rules, of course. You couldn't eat before the dead had tasted. You couldn't take leftovers from the table too soon. And you couldn't bring spoiled food. That was an insult. To offer mold was to invite misfortune. But if the ritual was done right, if the air was still, the prayers sincere, then the family felt it. A presence, a peace. The feast was complete. Not every tomb was visited. Some names faded, some families forgot. But even then, neighbors might leave a token offering. For those with no name, for those with no feast. This practice was not unique to Thebes. Variations existed in Saqqara, Abydos, even in small village necropolises. Where there was bread and grief, there was a table. Tonight, as you sit with your own memories, of those gone, of those missed, know this. In ancient Egypt, they did not fear the dead. They fed them, welcomed them, and believed truly that dinner was best when shared. Sleep gently. Someone may be visiting tonight. Dust hangs in the air. The offering table is bare. The bread is gone. The name on the wall is half erased. And in the stillness, something stirs. In ancient Egypt, the soul needed food, bread, beer, names spoken aloud, spells recited. But what happened when no one came? When the ritual stopped? When magic failed? The Egyptians had a word for this terror. Mut, the angry dead, the restless ones. Not demons, not monsters, just forgotten people. Souls whose families vanished, whose offerings ceased, whose names were swallowed by silence. It began slowly. A missed anniversary, a torn prayer scroll, a priest who didn't renew his contract. And then the Ka began to hunger, not just spiritually, but physically in their belief. An ache in the other world, a rumbling void. Texts from coffin lids describe the symptoms. My throat is dry. My stomach burns. My mouth opens and no taste enters. The soul becomes desperate, wandering. Hungry ghosts crept back to the world of the living, not out of evil, but out of need. They lingered near ovens, hid in granaries, whispered through kitchen fires. Animals grew sick, Children had nightmares. Crops failed without reason. The signs were subtle, but feared, and so the living made amends. Hasty offerings, bread left by doors, beer poured at crossroads, prayers shouted into wind, names written on shards of pottery and buried in soil, tokens to buy forgiveness. Priests developed emergency rituals, the reopening of tombs, a risky process, the tomb door unsealed, incense burned, a fresh loaf placed inside, the name re-spoken with trembling voice. Sometimes it worked. The haunting stopped. Sometimes it didn't. There were even spiritual bounty hunters, ritual readers who traveled from village to village, offering to calm disturbed tombs. They carried packs of dried food, scrolls of spells, and charged coins for peace. In rare cases, tombs were found with claw marks, not from animals, but human hands, scratching at the door from the inside. Desperate messages carved with broken pottery. I hunger. I am alone. Whether literal or symbolic, it chilled those who saw it. Families who abandoned their dead risked more than shame. They risked haunting. One funerary manual warns, forget your ancestor, and he will drink your sleep. Entire communities sometimes pooled offerings for the forgotten. In Saqqara, a common altar stood with the inscription, to all those whose names are lost. Let no soul hunger beneath this earth. Magic was powerful, but only if remembered. Spells faded when not recited. Names dissolved in wind and sand. Offerings decayed. Time eroded piety. But even then, hope remained. Some believed that a stranger could rescue a forgotten soul, that speaking a name, any name, could relight a spirit's hearth. These acts of kindness were rare, but revered. One inscription tells of a child who found a tomb with no offerings and whispered, bread and beer to you, stranger. That soul, it was said, guided her dreams for the rest of her life. So, tonight, if you hear a creak, if a shadow lingers near your meal, don't fear. Perhaps someone simply forgot their bread, and all they need is a name. Sleep warm, and if you pass an empty plate in your mind, leave something small. Even the silence can be filled. The feast is not fresh. It is memory. Stale bread on a stone table, a jar of beer long gone flat, but it still matters, because each crumb carries a story. As we step backward through the fog of time, the stories return like ghosts, not to haunt, but to remind. Once, we walked among the living, peasants grinding gritty grain under a relentless sun, mothers boiling onions for children who had no other choice. Food was not pleasure, it was endurance. The bread cut your mouth, the beer made you dizzy, but you ate because you had to, day after day. It was a routine so unchanging, it became sacred in its dullness. Then we wandered through kitchens filled with the smoke and fatigue, women stirring clay pots with wooden spoons, repeating the same motions their grandmothers had known. There was no invention, no joy, only sustenance, the monotony of porridge, the labor of pounding grain into something barely edible. There was no escape from it. Hunger always returned. In the storerooms, we found anxiety preserved in sealed jars. Food had to last. If it didn't, people died. Spoilage was a godless thief. Rats were an enemy. Mold was a prophecy. Every grain had to be guarded. Every date counted. Even when preserved with care, food spoiled. And when it did, the blame fell on rituals, on priests, on fate. Yet in the temples, food took on a different form. It was not eaten, it was shown, displayed before statues, measured, weighed, blessed, and then quietly consumed by the very priests who performed the rites. Gods did not chew, but they were fed, daily, religiously, because to feed the divine was to keep the universe turning. To miss a meal was to risk imbalance. But food was not always a blessing. It could carry disease, cracked teeth, abscesses, intestinal worms, tiny torments buried inside sacred loaves. The very act of nourishment wore people down. Their mummies revealed the truth. Behind the rituals and myths were aching jaws and infected guts. Even kings suffered from what they ate. Still, the meal did not end at death. The tomb became a pantry. Bread, beer, onions, meat, sealed in jars or painted on walls. These were not tributes, they were necessities. In Egypt's vision of the afterlife, you were only as strong as your next offering. If the bread stopped coming, so did your peace. But not all bread was kind. Sometimes it was a warning. Cursed food, spoiled on purpose, beer poured out, loaves split, plates turned upside down. These were not culinary accidents. They were statements, messages for thieves, traitors, or ungrateful sons. Food could protect, it could punish. Even so, once a year, the tombs opened. The feast of the valley brought the dead back home. Families sat beside graves, placing figs and beer on stone slabs, whispering stories and names. It wasn't mourning, it was reunion. The air filled with incense and memory. Bread passed from hand to absent hand. But not all tombs were visited. Some were forgotten, their names eroded, their offerings ceased. And with that silence came hunger. Spirits wandered, not evil, just empty. The magic meant to sustain them faded, and so the living left crumbs at crossroads, whispered names to the wind, scribbled blessings on shards of pottery, anything to calm the hunger. And now, here we are, at the last table. The food is gone, but the meaning remains. A civilization where food was never just food. It was ritual, status, memory, magic. It aged with you. It followed you. It judged you. And if you were lucky, it remembered you. So sleep with a full heart. And if you dream of bread tonight, offer it freely. Someone, somewhere, is still waiting. Tonight, we unpack the last basket. Not to eat, just to remember. What did the Egyptians truly carry into the afterlife? What made it onto the final grocery list of eternity? Start with bread. Always bread. Not soft or warm, but dense. Triangular. Stone hard, yet shaped with care. Loaves stacked like bricks. Some real, baked in sacred kitchens. Others sculpted from clay, carved onto tomb walls, or painted in ochre and black. Each one counted. Not for flavor, but for function. Next came beer. Thick, porridge-like beer stored in tall, sealed jars. It wasn't refreshing. It was ritual. Brewed from emmer, flavored with dates or herbs, sometimes sour, often spoiled, but always present. Beer was a promise. Every ka expected it. Then, onions, stacked in piles, braided, or placed whole. Their pungency believed to stir the senses of the dead. Garlic, too, both feared and revered. They weren't seasoning, they were symbols. Breath of the tomb, figs, dates, and sycamore fruit followed. Sweetness was rare, a sign of wealth, or a rare good year. Their presence was an indulgence, a memory of delight. Even dried, they spoke of kindness. Salted meats appeared when status allowed. Duck, goose, ox ribs, sometimes wrapped in linen, sometimes just bones on a platter. They didn't need to be edible. They needed to be recognized. Honey, rare and golden, was sealed in tiny pots, a gift for gods and ghosts alike. Lotus roots, fish dried with herbs, lentils, chickpeas, even cheese on occasion. Each item layered meaning. And then, the fake food, clay pastries, painted grapes, stone fish. They weren't deceit, they were belief made tangible. Magic would make them whole. Because to run out of offerings was to run out of self. Inventory lists, written in hieroglyphs, weren't shopping lists. They were life insurance. 3 loaves, 2 jugs, 1 goose, 5 onions. Not metaphors, declarations of identity, recipes for remembrance, even objects that mimicked cooking, miniature ovens, spoons, grinding stones, were included. Because the act of preparing food was sacred too. The kitchen itself was eternalized. In one tomb, a single model basket holds 6 loaves and a jar. No name, no spell, just presence. That was enough. So here we are, at the end of our long, dusty journey. We have walked through fields, pantries, kitchens, temples, tombs, and dreams, all of them filled with food, not for pleasure, not for taste, but for memory. If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for sitting through a story where bread was boring, beer was thick, and every crumb mattered. Thank you for drifting with us into a world where meals were not measured in calories, but in hope. If you found this story oddly comforting or just deeply weird, please consider liking the video, subscribing to our channel, and sharing this with someone who enjoys falling asleep to ancient, dusty facts. Leave a comment below. What would you pack in your tomb pantry? Until next time, sleep softly. May your name be spoken, may your loaf never mold, and may your table, in this world or the next, never be empty.